Hello and welcome to the curriculum consultation with OFS and HESA. My name is Ella Dobbs and I'm a senior analyst at the OFS. I'm joined here with my colleagues from HESA.
Ruth Underwood, I work in the liaison team.
And Rachel Wilkes, I'm product owner, work on the data features specification.
And Victoria Brown, also at HESA.
So throughout the presentation, please feel free to post your questions into the webinar software, and we will stop every so often to answer a few when we get a good batch. Otherwise, there'll be a session at the end as well where we can answer questions. And obviously, if there's anything that you think of after the webinar, you can always email those in as well. So I'm going to hand over to Rachel now to take you through the first part of the webinar.
Thank you, Ella. So we thought we'd start with today just to talk through a little bit about how the consultation itself is structured. So what we're going to look at today is starting off with that. We're going to have a look at why we're actually consulting, what the two options are in the consultation, just to make sure that everyone's clear on that. Then we'll walk through all of the scenarios to explain how they're all recorded for both options. Then we'll have a look at some of the general questions we've got kind of throughout the consultation and go through those. Then there'll be time, as Ella says, right at the end, if there are any other questions that we haven't already addressed. So let's get started. So the structure of the consultation itself. Right at the very beginning, there are some very long introduction and background sections where we've basically kind of tried to take you all on the journey that we've gone through as we've come to these two options. So explained all the things that we've looked at, explain where we've got to, explain what we've done, and kind of give you the general background to everything curriculum. Then we've got the introduction on the two proposals, and there's some big diagrams on there. You can download a PDF of all the diagrams separately if you want to print them all off, or right on the beginning page there's also a PDF of all the questions with the diagrams as well. So for those of you who like to print it off and go away and come back later, you can do. Otherwise, you can share questions and send the link to colleagues to look at your responses. So after the introductions, we've got some of the general questions, which is neither applicable to either of the options. They're more kind of curriculum in general. Then we've got all of the scenarios, some of which have got questions at the end, some of which haven't. You only need to respond to the scenarios that are relevant to you. You can respond to the others if you like, but it's up to you. And then right at the very end, we ask providers to indicate a preference to which of the options that you prefer. So we've got you to kind of answer a general option A or option B question, but then we've also given you the chance to say which of those you think might not work quite so well for that option. So if there's one particular that you think actually most of them is this option, but there's just this one thing that I think is the other option, you've got a chance to indicate that to us there. So why are we doing this consultation? In the current data features model, so that's the one that's at the moment published on the website, we still have course delivery. For a course delivery, you could have multiple options for the different courses that you're running. So if you've got one that's got a full year abroad, then that would be 4 years. Another course delivery that's just a 3-year one. If you've got one starting a year later, that would be another course delivery. And if you say you've got a part-time one as well, that would be another one that would carry on. So you've got the course delivery, which you would repeat every time you've got one of the different scenarios. And then you've got course session underneath that. And that's what we consider as the curriculum data. And then student course session comes off the course session, and that's the kind of student level data. And that's all in the current model. So the reason we are having another look at curriculum is because a lot of the feedback we've had from providers is that this kind of course delivery approach was causing you to do a lot of duplication in your system. So you're having to set up a lot of courses that you wouldn't necessarily consider courses, and it was causing a lot of problems for you. So that's one of the main reasons we've had a look at this, and we try to simplify that and take out as much duplication as we can so that you can record it in the way that you've got it held in your system. So that's kind of why we've looked at it this time. So in terms of what we want to consider, I'm going to hand back to Ella just to kind of give a perspective from OFS about what it is we needed to consider whilst we were doing this.
So the OFS and other statutory customers have been working really closely with HESA to prepare this consultation, making sure that it fits our needs as a new regulator. And also, now that we have an extremely diverse sector that we are regulating as the OFS, we need to make sure that certain things are consistent. So there's 5 things that we've had to consider while coming up with these options. The first one is that we need to ensure there's consistency across the sector. So we need to be able to analyse data for all providers in a consistent way. As I say, we've now got a very diverse sector that we are regulating, and we need to set structure in the data so that we can ensure that we are treating a provider where all of their provision starts in September consistently with a provider who say has 3 intakes a year in September, January and April. So we have to make sure that there is set structure to allow us to do that. We also need to make sure there's consistency with other processes that run on a sort of year basis. So, for example, the processes that the student loans company operate, and also in relation to Tier 4. We also need to make sure that there's consistency over time. So we need to be able to map the data, futures data, along with historic data to reduce time series and comparable metrics over years. We also don't want to make any assumptions about providers' provision or students. So, for example, if we don't make sure that providers return their data consistently, we might end up assuming something that isn't actually true. And the structure in the data is needed for that. For example, if we were to allow providers to return student core sessions of any length, then if a session starts in September and ends in April, we don't know whether the student has got a really long summer break or they've gone inactive, but the provider has forgotten to tell us this in the data. And then there are some certain constraints, and that mainly is related to the 12-year period. There are certain concepts that rely on that 12-month period. For example, mode of study and fees and funding need a 12-month period to allow us to identify those terms. So all of this has been captured in both options so that we can therefore analyse the data in a consistent way for all providers across the year. Okay, I'm going to hand back over to Ruth now.
Great. Thanks, Ella. So what I'm going to start by taking you through is a bit of an overview of the 2 proposals that we've got within the consultation before we have a bit of a look at some more detailed scenarios. So as Ella said, we came up with these 2 proposals working closely with statutory customers, and we also had a joint workshop with statutory customers and providers to try and come up with options that worked for both groups, and that's led us to these 2 proposals. So option A proposes that we remove the course delivery and course session entities within the model and replace those with a course entity. And that would contain high-level information about the course, so what level of qualification, what subject, is it a teacher training course, that sort of thing. But it would contain no date information, so the curriculum would not be wedded to a particular period of time. We'd remove any curriculum dates. That course would then link directly to the student course session, which must be 12 months. So that would then only have one layer of curriculum data with the course, and that would link directly to the student data on the student course session. Within the consultation, you'll be able to see a list of fields and data that we're proposing is held at that course level, so you'll be able to provide kind of comment on our proposal for that as well. And there are a couple of questions that we'll get onto later around the data held at that level. But in option A, as I said, the course would link directly to the student course session, and it's at the student level that we would collects the type of activity that the student's undertaking. So, for example, are they doing a placement year? Are they doing a foundation year? And so what we hope is that alleviates some of the concerns providers had around the duplication of courses, because it means you could have one course to represent a first degree in a certain subject, and then it's at the student level that we'd identify some of those differences in the student activity, rather than forcing you to separate those out into different courses. So if we look at that in terms of kind of the most basic example, a student doing a first degree in maths, you would have one course, first degree in maths, and then 3 student course sessions if the student moves through that course as expected. They'd have one student course session for each year that they attend on that course. And those student course sessions must be a year in option A for the reasons that Ella's run through. We need that year-long chunk of time to represent each year of the student's activity. So that's an overview of option A. Option B is similar in terms of what we're proposing for the course entity. So this proposes still removing the course delivery and having a course entity containing very similar data to option A and not containing dates. But what option B proposes is having another layer of curriculum data called the session year. This is essentially a year-long chunk of time associated with that course, representing your different intakes and start dates for the years on your courses. So you wouldn't need a different session year to represent different types of activities, so placement years or foundation or mode, but you would need a different session year to represent different intakes. So if you had September and January intakes, those would need to be different session years, and you'd need a different session year for every year that you ran a course. So it started in September 2019, then September 2020, and so on. So as I said, what that does is add in that extra layer of curriculum data. You've still got the high-level course, but you then have these year-long session years sitting underneath that. And what that gives you is a bit of context to the student's activity. So we now know when that year was planned to start, for example, so then we might know that the student started late. And as we're going through the scenarios, hopefully we'll demonstrate what that session year gives you in certain scenarios where having that additional context is useful for interpreting the student's activity in a useful way. So again, just looking at that most basic scenario, student doing a first degree in maths over 3 years. The course information would be very similar to option A. You would then have these year-long session years representing, in this example, the September intake. What that means is that the student course sessions wouldn't necessarily have to be a year. They could reflect the dates that the student actually interacted with those session years. So if the student left early or started late, or for a kind of traditional academic year, in this example, ran from September to June, you could have an end date for those student course sessions in June because the year-long requirement is covered by that session year. So hopefully that will become clearer as we go through some of the other scenarios. But before we do that, just a quick kind of high-level overview of some of the kind of pros and cons of the two. With option A, because we've only got that one layer of curriculum data, for the more kind of basic scenarios, students doing what you expected them to do, it is probably more straightforward. And in those scenarios, perhaps the session year doesn't add to the information. However, what it does mean is that those student course sessions must be a year long. And we'll pick up on this in some of the scenarios, but in certain cases that becomes more problematic if the student's moving between courses or going dormant or resitting for short periods of time, for example. Whereas in option B, it does have that extra layer of curriculum data, and therefore it does introduce a bit of complexity. However, and again, this hopefully become clear as we go through the scenarios, having that additional session year gives a bit of context to the student's information and allows a bit more flexibility at the student course session level in terms of what you can record. So before we go into the scenarios, I think we've got a few questions that we can just pause to answer.
Well, it's actually only one question.
Okay.
Someone has asked, in option A, it doesn't look like the actual student date, e.g. if the academic year was to end in May, would ever be captured. Is that correct? And does HESA not need to know these dates?
I think that is correct, because in option A, the student course sessions would have to be a year. So if, for example, your year ran from September to June, you would have to record September to August for it to be a year long, because we need that year-long chunk of time. So, yeah, that's right. Those dates would not be recorded.
And that's no different to the way you'd currently record it in the student record.
Yes. And from a statutory customer's point of view, the only dates we would need to know is if when the student left or withdrew, you would then return the end date of that student course session earlier than the year. But otherwise, we don't need to know. Oh, and we've had a follow-up question. Okay, the follow-up question is, what if the end date changes mid-year because of timetable changes? Can the actual end date be adjusted in both scenarios?
Yes, I think so. So in option A, if the student was continuing, that wouldn't make a difference because the student course sessions have to be a year, so it would still need to represent the end of that 12-month period. If it was the final student course session, then yes, you could adjust it to show the end date when it actually ended. In option B, you would have the year-long session years and the student course sessions. You would record an end date when they actually ended, in which case, yeah, you could adjust that to show when it actually ended, when that happened. So that doesn't need to be kind of returned up front and then not changed. Yep, right.
Okay.
I think we have another question to have a look at.
I'm just coming slightly closer to the microphone because we've had some people say they can't quite hear.
Okay.
So we've had another question that says, when you refer to a year/session year, do you mean a level year, e.g. first year of a traditional degree, or do you mean a 12-month period?
So we mean a 12-month period in terms of session years. It may be that, depending on your course, that represents the level between the different years, but we do mean a 12-month period.
And that is the same for any type of provision, so any kind of flexible provision or part-time provision, you need to break it down into 12-month periods to return the data.
Okay, another question. With option B, does session year have to sit under a specific course, or can session year sit at an organisational level independent of course?
So it would need to sit at the course level because there's information there that needs to be linked to the student. So you link a student to a session year is associated with a course, and therefore we know what, for example, what level the student's studying at, what subject they're studying in. So it does need to link to the course, so you've got that information.
Okay, and the final little question, which is someone's asked whether the questions and answers will be available after the session, and yes, they will be. So if you've missed anything, don't worry, you'll be able to review them later.
And we'll share the slides with you as well. Anyone who's registered to the event, we'll share those, so you'll have everything that we're using.
Okay, so I will crack on then with going through some of these scenarios. There are 11 scenarios within the consultation. I'll run through all of them. Some of them are quite similar and some are more complicated than others, so we'll spend more time on some of them than others, but just to kind of give you that overview about how these different scenarios will return, we'll touch on all of them. So they start off at the kind of basic end with a full-time 3-year course. So that maths first degree that we've shown against the two options. So if a student's studying for 3 years and they move through the course as expected, in option A, what you'd have is a first degree in maths, and then for each year the student engages, they'd have a student course session. So in this example, they'd have 3 student course sessions representing that year-long period. So in this example, September to August. But if students start at different times of the year, you have different intakes, they would all be linked to the same course. So in this example, we've got September starters, January starters, April starters. They'd all be linked to the same course, and those dates will be represented at the student level. So again, we're hoping that reduces the duplication of having to have different deliveries for those different intakes, as was in the previous data futures model. If we look at that against option B, in terms of the data at the student level, it's going to look very similar. Each student's going to need 3 student course sessions. The difference is we have that additional layer of curriculum data, so we've got the session years. And as I explained, you'd need a different set of session years for each of your intakes. So you've got September intake, a January intake, and an April intake. Each of those would need their own session years covering that 12-month period. And the students would be linked to the session year that represents the intake that they're a part of. What you'll see on there is what that means is that the student course sessions can be slightly shorter. So in the top example, Di is attending year 1 from September to June. So that can then represent your actual term dates and years rather than having to stick to the 12-month period as is in option A. So that's the first scenario. If we move on then to a part-time scenario, there is a question in the consultation about mode of study and where that should sit within the model. In the current Data Futures model, we've got a mode against the course delivery, and you therefore need different course deliveries for different modes. But we've kind of got a question in there to get your feedback on whether that should sit at the curriculum level. So if it does sit at the curriculum level, you would need to have a different course for first degree in maths part-time. And then the students would be linked to that, and again have in option A, those year-long student course sessions, one for each year that they engage with that course. If the mode didn't sit at the course level, the student data would look very similar, and you still need those year-long student course sessions. It would just be that they can be linked to the same course as the full-time students, rather than having to separate them out. So that's that against option A. Similar to the full-time version, option B looks very similar, but it's got those year-long session years, that layer of curriculum data in between, showing that, in this example, September intake of students, and the student is linked to the session year, and the student course sessions then reflect the dates they're actually studying for each year. Okay. So scenario 3 is looking at placement information. And as Rachel mentioned earlier, this was one area where we got quite a lot of feedback that potentially within a lot of provider systems, you don't separate out your courses that have an optional placement between students who do a placement and students who don't. So a lot of you said you didn't want to be forced to have different course deliveries for the versions with and without a placement. So both options rectify that issue. So in option A, you might have a student who is doing 3 years of a maths first degree. They would have 3 student course sessions. But a student doing a placement, having in their 3rd year in this example, would be linked to the same course. They would just have an additional student course session. And that 3rd student course session would be data returned against that student course session would indicate that they're doing a placement year, rather than that being held at the curriculum level. So that means that, as I said, you wouldn't be forced to separate out your courses between the placement and non-placement version, although it's worth saying that if you do hold it in that way in your systems, you can separate them out if you prefer to do so. So you could have 2 separate courses, one for students who do a placement and one for students who don't, or it could all be one course. So these proposals kind of aim to have that flexibility, so where possible, you can return it the way that it's set up in your systems. And the same is true of option B. It just looks a little bit different because, as I said, you've got those session years within the curriculum data. So in this example, we're looking at a September intake. So you'd have 1 session year for every year that you had that September intake. And your student who's doing a placement would need 3 student course sessions, and so would be linked to session years A, B, and C. Whereas your student who is doing a placement would need 4 student course sessions and so be linked to A, B, C, and D. So even though for session year C, Di is doing a placement year, Di is not doing a placement year, and Ruth is doing a placement year, they're both linked to the same session year. So again, it doesn't force that duplication at the curriculum level. We know that from the student level data. Similar scenario in terms of foundation years. This is another one where we had feedback from providers about how these are returned. So again, we've got Di studying her first degree in maths without a foundation year, and she would be linked to the same course as Charlie, who is studying the first degree in maths with a foundation year. So in this example, Charlie would just have an additional student course session, and it's at that student level that it would be marked as a foundation year. And again, very similar for option B. Both students are linked to the same course. But it's at the student level where we get that distinction between the fact that Charlie's doing a foundation year and Di is not. And they're both linked to course session year A for their first year, even though one's doing a foundation year and one is not. So with the placement scenario and the foundation year example, they're very similar, and we're just trying to demonstrate that we've tried to remove the need for that duplication of your courses where you don't wish to separate them out. We have got a couple of scenarios within the consultation around resits. So the first one is where the student does a full year resit. They start on the September 2019 cohort, but they have to resit their full first year, and so essentially switch to the kind of September 2020 cohort. So in that example, the student would be linked, for option A, the student would be linked directly to that maths first degree, and they would have 4 student course sessions. The first one is them attending their first year, and the second one is them resitting their first year, and then the subsequent 2 are them completing years 2 and 3. So whereas in the previous data futures model with this concept of course deliveries, you would have had to move the student to a different delivery because they've switched between the 2019 and the 2020 cohort. That's no longer required within option A or option B. They can all be linked to the same course, and we'll know from the student data that the student is resitting that year. Again, option B looking quite similar. We've got those session years running from September to August because the student is still on a September starter cohort, just moving between the 2019 and the 2020 start. They keep being linked to those September 2020 session years. And if a student was studying on this course and did not need to resit their first year, they would still be linked to the same session year as Alice in this example, who is resitting her first year. So again, all of that information about the student's activity is held at the student level rather than requiring different session years for different activity that the student's doing. So that's a full year resit. A little more complicated scenario is a part year resit. So in this example, the provider has 2 intakes, one in September and one in January. And Sam attends the first year of her course in the September cohort, passes her first year, no problem. Then she starts the second year and completes 1 semester, so from September to December. At that point, she needs to resit that first semester. And rather than wait until the following September cohort and have to wait a year to do that, the provider allows her to switch to the January cohort. So she completes the first term of year 2 starting in September, and then does that again in January, and then continues her course with the January cohort. This one does look quite different between the 2 options because of that switching of cohorts that Sam has done. So if we look at option A, Sam's linked directly to the first degree in maths, and so has 4 student course sessions. As we know, those must be a year long. So she started in September. First 3 student course sessions would be September to August, as they must be a year, and there'd be a final student course session at the end for a few months to show that little tail end of activity that's been added on because she's done that resit. So might look quite straightforward. You've got each being a year-long student course session, but what that means is you've got activity across different course years within the same student course session. So if you look at student course session 3 in this example, it's 1 year, but what's actually happening there is that Sam is finishing off year 2 and starting year 3. So what you're having to do is kind of shoehorn Sam's activity into those year-long student course sessions, rather than representing what she's actually doing at that point is that she's switched the January cohort and so is studying years 2 and 3 from January to December. In option B, it looks quite different because what we've got is these session years, which show the planned course years that the student is interacting with. So because this provider has a September cohort and a January cohort, they would have 2 sets of session years, one set starting in September, the other starting in January. What this means is that we can be more flexible with the length of the student course sessions because we've got the context of the session years. We know what's going on. So in this scenario, what you'd return is the first student course session is all fine, that's 1 year. Sam completes that, no problem. Sam then starts to attend year 2 from September to December. And at the point of December, switches cohorts. So at that point, what you'd be able to do is then close that student course session, open up a new one linked to the session years that start in January. So you're able to then reflect the fact that Sam has switched cohorts. And the student course sessions can reflect the actual pattern of study. So when Sam switches to the January cohort, you can return a student course session from January to December, representing her studying her second year, and then the following year, another from January to December, showing her activity for her third year. So this is where kind of the benefit of the session years start to come in, because we have the context that we know from the session years she's been linked to that Sam has switched cohorts, and therefore you can represent what she's actually doing in her second and third years, rather than in option A, kind of having to force the activity into those year-long student course sessions. We can allow a bit more flexibility at the student course session level because we've got the context of the session years. Okay, so I'll move on to scenario 6 then. This example, we've got a late starter. So what we mean by that is the student started late, as it sounds like, and they're catching up with the rest of their cohort. So in this example, we've got a student, a course that starts in September. The student joins in November, but they're not, that's not a separate cohort. They're just joining on to the same cohort and catching up with their fellow students. So we have a requirement to be able to identify those students within the data, which is where this scenario has come from. So in option A, there's your example of the student who started on time in September and moved through as expected. They'd have 3 student course sessions running for a year. However, in this example, Rachel started a little bit late, so she joins the September course in November. They'll both be linked to the same course because the curriculum data doesn't have any dates, but Rachel would have a later start date. So we could see from the start date that Rachel started in November. However, we've got no way of knowing whether that November start is part of the September cohort. Is that another intake that you have? We don't know what's going on there. Because we don't have any dates on the curriculum level, there's no way to identify that other than having some kind of flag within the data. So we'd need a specific field within the data to record the fact that Rachel is a late starter and is catching up with her fellow students. Whereas in option B, we do have dates against the curriculum. We've got these session years. So we know in this example that the course started in September because the session years start in September. So we're able to see the difference between the September start date on the session years and the November start date on Rachel's student course session. So because we have that context of the session years, we don't need a particular field within the data to flag up that those students are late starters. So again, it's where the session years come into play in terms of giving context to what the student's doing, and therefore we can allow the student data to not need those kind of bespoke requirements that you'd need to return against each student that did this. Scenario 7 then, we're looking at a transfer within a provider. So in this example, Hannah starts off doing a first degree in physics and after a couple of months decides, actually, no, I want to do a first degree in maths. So you would have returned her as studying on a first degree in physics, and at the point that she transfers, you would need to close down that student course session with a reason for closing of transferred, and then return a new student course session against the first degree in maths. That would require that late starter flag to be returned again, because as far as the maths course is concerned, Hannah is a late starter onto the maths course and is catching up with her fellow students. So again, the student course sessions would have the date that Hannah started, but you need the late starter flag to show that she's started late on the maths course and is catching up with her fellow students. In option B, it starts off very similar, so you would have that first student course session returned against the first degree in physics, and then given an end date and a reason for ending of transferred once the student does transfer. And then a new student course session would be returned against the first degree in maths. But as with the late starter, this time we don't require a late starter flag to be returned against the student, because again, we know from the session year that this was planned to start in September, but Hannah's start date against the maths course is in November. So we know that she's starting late on that course. We have a scenario within the consultation regarding postgraduates. In terms of your PGT students, that would probably look largely similar to your undergrads. In terms of PGR, for option A, again, it might look very similar. You've got defined the aim and level of the qualification at the course level. The student course sessions will start whenever the student starts and then run for a year, as they must represent that year-long activity. So you have, in this example, September to August until the student finishes. At some point, for your PGRs, in most cases, we'd probably see a change to writing up at some point during their activity. So that would be recorded as a session status change within the model. So the session status sits with the student course session, and within there you're able to record the student's move to writing up and a date on which that happened, like you do in the current student collection. So that's what it would look like in option A. In option B, again, we've got the session years in there. We've had some conversations with providers around PGR students. We know that some of you have quite flexible start dates for your PGR students. And as soon as we start putting dates on curriculum data, that becomes complicated for any kind of very flexible programs. So the way that it would need to be returned for returning session years for PGRs is to have, if you have a particular intake during the year, you'd need session years to represent that. If you have a completely flexible start on any day of the year, it might be that you need to have session years representing each month or each quarter, and you could link students to the most appropriate one. But we are interested in your feedback within the consultation on how this could work for very flexible courses. So that could be PGR, or it could be very flexible undergraduate courses, and how you think that might work, or would it work. So please do let us know, because as I said, we're conscious when you put dates on curriculum, that is inevitably going to make those kinds of courses more complicated. Scenario 9 then is broken into 3 parts, representing different examples of a student being dormant. So the first example is where the student takes a full year dormant, so they complete their first year, starting in the September cohort. They're then dormant for a full year, and so when they return to complete their second year, they're still in a September cohort. So in option A, what you'd see is the students linked directly to their first degree in maths. They have their first student course session running for a year, which they complete, but at the end of it, you can tell us with the reason for ending against that student course session that the student has interrupted. So if you tell us at the end of that student course session, student has gone dormant, you then wouldn't need to return the following year, because we know that the student has gone dormant, so we know why they're not there. So you wouldn't need to return them until they actually came back to active study, or they decided that they weren't coming back. So in this example, what you'd see is student course session 1 with a reason end of interrupted, nothing returned for a year, and then when the student comes back, linked to the same course with the appropriate dates showing the point at which they came back. And it would look quite similar for option B, just with those additional session years. So you return the first student course session with a reason for ending of interrupted. Then there'd be a missing year where you don't need to return that information because we know that they've interrupted. And then when they return, they just be linked to the session year that represents the new intake that they're on. So when Emily comes back, she's studying with the September 2021 cohort, so she'd be linked to that appropriate session year to represent what she's doing. Scenario 2, showing dormancy, is also a full year dormant, but it's slightly offset from the student's pattern of study. So in this example, Becky starts studying in September. She studies until December and then takes a full year dormant from the following January to December. So it's still 1 year, but it doesn't line up nicely with the years that she's studying. So for this one, we have 2 ideas for how this might be returned for option A, and we're interested in your feedback within the consultation as to if one of those works better than the other. In idea number 1, you would start returning the student in September when they start, and when they become dormant, you would close down that student course session. So in December 2019, you close it down, say this student has interrupted, and then you wouldn't need to return them again until they come back in January 2022. So that period of dormancy just wouldn't be returned, similar to the other kind of whole year dormancy scenario. So that's idea number 1. You'd return them for a few months, say they've interrupted, and not return them again until they come back following January. In idea number 2, we would see that intervening period where the student is dormant. So you would have year-long student course sessions. Each of them run from September to August, but we would see from the session status updates that you return which parts of those student course sessions are dormant. So you'd return the student starting in September, and then when they go dormant in December, rather than closing down that student course session, you'd give us a session status update to say this student is now dormant. And then the next student course session starting the following September would also need a session status to indicate that they're starting off dormant. And you would update the status again when the student returned to an active mode. So in idea 2, for how this would be returned, in terms of what we know about what the student's doing, it looks very similar. So we know when they went dormant and we know when they came back. The difference is how you return that, in terms of, do you return student course sessions representing that period of dormancy, or do you just return nothing? So as I said, we're interested in your feedback within the consultation on whether you have a preference in the way that would be returned. For option B, we don't have those 2 ideas, again, because the session years kind of give you the context as to what the student's doing. So you wouldn't need to return that intervening period. So Becky starts year 1 and studies from September to December. At that point, you'd close down the student course session with a reason of interrupted, and then you wouldn't return Becky again until January 2021. When they come back. So with option A, we've got those 2 proposals, as I said. In option B, because we've got the session years, we think it works that you just wouldn't return the student in those intervening periods, because we know, for example, when she comes back in January 2021, she'd be linked to the September 2020 session year. So we can see what Becky's pattern of study. The final dormancy scenario then is the more complicated one, where the student goes dormant for a part year. So this is quite similar to the student doing a part year resit scenario that we ran through. The provider has a September cohort and a January cohort. So in this example, Matt starts studying and attends part of year 1, so studies from August to December. Matt is then dormant for a term, so from January to March. And when he comes back from his period of dormancy, the provider switches him onto the January cohort. So rather than having to be dormant for the full year, they allow him to swap onto the January cohort and continue studying the rest of year 1 and then years 2 and 3 with that January cohort. So how that would look against the 2 options. In option A, as we've said, the student course session must be a year long. So the first student course session and the first 3 student course sessions would run from September to August, with a short one at the end to tie up the activity before Matt finishes his course. So what you'd need to do is student course session 1 would be returned in September, and then in December, when Matt goes dormant, you'd have a session status update to show that he's moved to a dormant status. And Similar to that resit example, what you'd need to do is that activity that Matt's doing would need to be forced into those year-long student course sessions. So what student course session would represent is Matt finishing off year 1 and starting year 2. Student course session 3 would be Matt finishing off year 2 and starting year 3, with a little one at the end to show Matt finishing off the 3rd year of his course. So they'd need to be a year, and therefore some of them would show activities spanning different course years once Matt switches cohorts. In option B, it doesn't have to be returned in that way, again, because we've got those session years. So because the provider has 2 intakes, they'd have a set session year starting in September and a set starting in January. So when the student first starts, they'd be returned against the September set of session years. But once they've gone dormant and come back, we'd see them linked to the January starting session years. So we know that they've switched cohorts. And they can therefore have slightly varying lengths of student course session to represent what they're actually doing. So once Matt comes back to finish year 1, he would be linked to the January set of session years and would have a student course session running from March to December to represent him finishing off his first year with the January cohort. Then he could complete year 2, and that would be represented by 1 student course session, again against the January cohort. And then the third year, again, would just need to be 1 student course session against the January cohort. So rather than having to split out the activity across different years and have student course sessions that span different years, you'd be able to have the student course sessions representing what Matt is actually doing. Okay. Scenario 10 then is looking at 15-month curriculum. We had a couple of questions on this, so just wanted to clarify how it would need to be returned. If you run courses that are sort of 15 months, 14 months, 18 months, we still have a requirement for that year-long period of time. So the first student course session you return would need to be 12 months. So in this example, the provider has a course that starts in September and runs until the following November. So what we need to see in option A is 1 student course session running from September to August, and then a short tail end student course session running from the following September to November to represent that last couple of months of activity. Same is true of option B. You would just have those additional session years. So you'd have the 2 session years starting in September. And again, Susie would have 2 student course sessions, 1 representing the first year of activity and 1 representing kind of the final few months of activity where she finishes off her course. The final scenario then is fully flexible. We spoke about this briefly when we were talking about PGRs. In option A, this is more straightforward. You might have a first degree that you offer on a fully flexible basis, so the student can sign up at any point during the year. So in option A, what you would do is just start off their student course sessions from the point at which that student starts. And then they would be 12 months long until the student finishes. So in this example, you've got Andy starting in September, Joe starting in January, all linked to the same course. The student course session just shows when the student started, and they have year-long student course sessions until they finish. In option B, as I've said, we add in dates into the curriculum, which does make it more complex. So as I mentioned when we were talking about PGRs, we're interested in your feedback on how this could work. It might be that you need different sets of session years throughout the year that you can then link students to the most appropriate one. But as I said, we know that having dates on curriculum makes fully flexible a bit more complicated. So we are definitely interested in your feedback on that one. So those are all of the scenarios within the consultation. We just wanted to kind of summarize option B for you to make sure it was clear. Looking at each of the scenarios independently, it's useful to look at them all together against option B just to clarify how it would need to be returned. So I'll talk you through this next slide. There's quite a lot of information on it, but essentially you have 1 set of session years for each intake. So in this example, we're looking at the September intake. And each of the scenarios we've run through could all be linked to the same set of session years. So you've got your full-time 3-year student doing it as expected, you've got your late starter, your student doing a full-year resit, you've got a placement year, you've got a foundation year. All of those scenarios only need one set of session years because a session year is just a period of time. So all of that different activities a student might be doing, that's fine. They all are linked to the same session years, and we know from the student level data what's going on. When you would need different session years, as I've said, is for your different intakes. So you might have a September intake, January intake, and April intake. And that is when you would need different sets of session years. So that is all we wanted to run through in terms of the scenarios and an overview of the proposals. Do we have any questions to run through?
Yes, we do.
Yeah, okay.
So there have been lots of questions, but some of them relate to some of the things that we're going to talk about next. So we're not ignoring them, and we will answer them. But in this session, I'm just going to talk about ones that relate to the options and the scenarios. Okay, so the first question is year of incidence still a concept in both options? So a student starting in March but then changing to a September to September year still has their activity for the year measured over the March to March cycle.
So I think, please correct me if I'm wrong, that this varies slightly between the two options. So in option A, yes, if the student starts in March, their years must always start in March. So that year of instance is still a concept for things like, as Ella was talking about, mode and funding years and that kind of thing. In option B, it's a little more flexible. So you start the student course session when the student starts, but if they do move cohorts, as we were looking at the part year resit example, their kind of year can change to align with what they're actually doing. So if they start off in the September cohort, move to the January cohort, then their year moves to being January to December. So it is different between the two options.
Okay. I also apologise that these questions are quite a random order just as they're coming through. So next one is, what happens if in option B, students on, say, year 1 and year 2 in the same year, so the same session year, have slightly different start dates?
I think when we were discussing this, if it was a day or two, it would probably be fine. I think one of the things we will have to come to an agreement on with everyone is exactly how much flexibility we can give you. So can it be up to a week? Can it be up to a month? I think we want to allow you some flexibility. I think we haven't decided exactly how much that's going to be. So that's a question that we're going to ask ourselves once you've all responded to the consultation. So if you have any thoughts on that, feel free to fill it in and send us across your suggestion.
Okay, another question about option B. If you are adding the additional entity, session year, why would you not want other fields on this, like foundation year?
I think this is mainly based on the feedback from providers and wanting to allow that flexibility in how you return it. Most of the benefit of the session year in the scenarios I was running through comes from knowing the dates of the intake in terms of the student's activity in relation to those dates. If we added on additional information like foundation years and placement years, it would force you to have different session years for that different activity. And generally the feedback's been that that's not really what providers want and not the way that they hold it. So that's why those are just a period of time.
But there is a question in the consultation about whether you would like any other fields added to those session years. So if you think that it would be a good idea, feel free to make your opinions known in your consultation responses. Okay, another one on option B. Would you need to set up session years up to 6 or more in case of need for resit, or can you add session years onwards only once you know they are needed?
So I think the general principle in what data teachers is now moving to with discrete collections is you only need to return the things that are relevant. So in the past, in the seminars we did last year, we said you could return all of the curriculum stuff up front and then attach students as they kind of do stuff and as they progress. But now with discrete collections, you don't need to do that. So for that example, you'd only need to return the session years that are relevant for students doing something in that reference period against that session year. you wouldn't necessarily need to link them to or return all of the future ones. There is a question that we probably will come around to later on about whether people want to try and return modules in advance. So we are going to be having a look at this to seeing if we can allow you to do it, but we will ignore it. But at the moment for this, we only need you to return stuff where students are actually linked to that.
Okay, so someone is asking, is it possible to use different options for specific course delivery types? For example, PGRs that have a start date whenever could be student-led and returned as option A, but other programs that have different intakes could be returned as option B.
So that's why the very, very final question in the consultation is worded in the way that we worded it. We want you to indicate a preference for all of your students, but as we were going through the scenarios, so postgraduates as that example, we agree. We're not sure whether our preference of option B actually is the right thing for those students. So yes, we are considering allowing certain students to have an exception, say we were to go down option B to allow them to do option A. But that's going to be based on your feedback and what you say. One of the things we have to avoid is we can't have you kind of doing a half and half scenario, because that will be incredibly confusing for us and for you returning it. So it will have to be a by exception case, and we will have to clearly identify what those exceptions are. So I guess the answer is yes, but we're kind of waiting on feedback to decide what that might be and what the exceptions might be.
So another question on different options and how the curriculum is returned. So would you be able to confirm that in either option, we can still choose to return different courses based on location, mode and delivery type, as well as start date should we wish?
Yes, that's kind of the way that it's structured will allow you to have that flexibility. So if you have the same course at different venues or different modes or different ways of delivery, they could all be bundled up into one course, but they could be separated out if that's the way that you hold it. So both options allow for that flexibility, so you kind of can hopefully set it up in a way that's closer to what is in your system rather than us forcing you to separate them out.
Okay. So some specific scenario questions now. Okay, so with scenario 7, option A, would this require the same number as the session start date would change?
Sorry, scenario
I can't remember
7, option A, did you say?
I'm scrolling back. I think that's the transfer one, is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. So I think the rules would be similar to the current student collection. So they're transferring between two different first degrees. They're transferring at the same level, so that would be the same numbers and part of the same engagement. You just have the different student course sessions to show the courses they've transferred between.
Okay. With scenario 9I, is it possible to return a dormant student once they've interrupted, or do they need to be excluded from the return?
So this is related to the way that you can indicate that a student is dormant. If at the end of their student course session you know that they're not going to be coming back, you can give them a reason end of interrupted, and then we know they're dormant, and then you don't have to return them. But we know there are cases where they might finish their first year and you didn't know that they were going dormant. You don't know until they come back, in which case you can return a student course session for them with a session status saying they've now gone dormant. So it allows for both ways depending on when you find out that information. We just need you to at some point positively confirm to us this student's gone dormant. It just might happen at different times depending on what the student's up to.
Okay, with the late starter scenario, how late is late? Is there a working definition for when a late starter flag would be needed?
I guess the simple answer is no. We've generally gone with the principle of you'd only be able to return them as a late starter if they were genuinely catching up with the other students you're kind of relating them to. But in terms of exactly how late is, to be honest, no, we haven't come up with that definition.
Okay, I think we will carry on now and get back to some more questions after the next session.
Okay, thank you. So the next part then that we will run through is some of the general questions within the consultation. So the consultation, as Rachel said, runs through all the scenarios and asks you some questions about the particular options and asks you to give an overall preference to which option you want. However, there are also a few general questions at the end that relate to both options. So some kind of general questions about what curriculum data is and what should sit at that curriculum level. So now I've managed to talk over my scrolling. I will run through the actual general questions that we have. So within the current student collection and within the data futures model, we have a funding level field. That field contains two concepts at the moment. So one is about what level the course is, and one is about the length of the year. So is it a long year? I think it's over 45 weeks. So we've got two different concepts kind of mushed together within the same field, which we know is not usually the right way of doing things. So what we've asked is for your thoughts on separating that out into two different fields. So the level side of the field could sit at a curriculum level, so on the course, because it's about the level of study and so should sit with the kind of course aim equivalent information. Whereas the length of year would need to be at the student course session level because it can vary between years, so it would need to sit at the student level and be flagged up on the student course session. So that's what we're proposing, and on that one, we're generally just asking for your comment on that proposal. Is that an issue? Would you be supportive of that change? We've also asked for your thoughts on accreditation and initiatives information. Within the current data futures model and proposed within the consultation, accreditation and initiatives are both held against the course. But we've had some feedback around this, and we know that these can change. So a course can gain and lose accreditation. You can be associated with and then not associated with different initiatives. So there are a couple of ways that we could record that to get around it. In one way of doing it would just be that if that information changes, you just have to return a new course. The information of the course has changed, and therefore a new course needs to be returned to reflect that. But we're interested in your feedback on that. Some providers have indicated that, when, for example, a course gains accreditation, you don't consider that a different course. It's just the course has gained accreditation. So another thing we could potentially do is have that information held at a course level, but with associated dates. So you could record when an accreditation, for example, is valid from, and if to lose accreditation, you record when it was valid to, so when that accreditation was lost. So that would require recording of dates against that information, but it would stop you having to create new courses when that information changes. So we're interested in your feedback on whether one of those approaches would work better for you than another. The next general question is around the year of programme field. So within our current student collection, you record a year of programme for each student, which year of the course of the programme is that student currently on. And within the current data futures model, this sits on the course session. And we want your feedback on where this should sit and where this field is currently difficult for you to return. So we know that there are some courses where this concept doesn't really apply, and we're aware of some of those around kind of fully flexible, some PGR courses, but we're interested if you've got any other examples, make sure we've kind of covered those bases in terms of where this information is difficult to return. But we're also asking a more general question about the requirement for this field. So we've asked our statutory customers what they use this field for currently, and we've come up with kind of a specific list of use cases of where it's used. There is a need to have some kind of understanding of a student's progression through a course. So did they come straight onto the second year, or are they resitting a year, for example? But this could be recorded in a number of different ways. So again, we're interested in your thoughts. Would it be better to return a year of programme for all students where that concept applies? And then we can see from that, are they resitting? Are they a direct entrant? Or should that field not be returned? And then we have kind of specific flags so you can let us know when a student is resitting or a direct entrant. So it's kind of returned by exception for those students rather than return for everyone and we figure it out. So again, we are interested in your feedback on that one. There's think there's a bit more information in the consultation about the kind of examples that we've got of where that data is needed. The next one then is around sandwich courses and sandwich information. So within the consultation, we propose that there's a field on the course that flags up where that course has the option of completing a sandwich placement. So we're not saying you need 2 courses for those that do and don't have a sandwich. It's you flagging up that that is an option. So we've asked a question in the consultation about whether that's problematic in any cases. We have already had some feedback from a previous event about recording thick and thin sandwiches against the same course and how that will work. So we need to kind of follow up on that one and let you know so if you have one course and the student might do a thick or thin sandwich, how would you record that? So we need to work through that example. But generally, we're just interested in your feedback on having that at that level and if that causes any issues. All of the details of which students do a placement and the details of their placement would still be held against the student course session. So as I said, this is just a flag that there's the option of doing that sandwich placement. So those are all of the general questions that we're going to run through. We've got just a bit of general information about the consultation. Responses are required by the 11th of September. We are using a new bit of consultation software. So any of you who did our GMC consultation or our big HESA consultation will have used this, but it's different to the one that we've used before. What it allows you to do is save and come back later within the consultation. And when you do that, it'll give you a unique link that you can email to colleagues. So if you want people to be able to review it before you hit the submit button, you'll be able to do that. Also, once you do finally hit the submit button, a copy of your responses will be sent to the email address that you entered at the beginning. So if you're one of those providers who always have to ask us for a copy, that will just be automatic now. So hopefully that's a slightly more streamlined process for the consultation. We'll pause now again to go through any questions that are coming in.
Okay. So again, these are going to be quite randomly ordered. I apologise. Okay, so we have a question around year prog and foundation year zeros. So please can you explain the rationale behind removing the option of having a year 0 for programs? I appreciate there is a foundation marker, but not having the value of 0 will cause large-scale changes for providers.
Yeah, we've had this feedback from a few providers. I think the logic of it was just that having a 0th year isn't really a thing. So it's sort of the first year of a course should be year 1, whether that's a foundation year or otherwise. I think that's where that came from. It's definitely something that we'll need to consider once we've got your feedback on year prog in general, and we decide what we're doing with that field. We'd need to make sure we've got the guidance for that straightened out. So I don't think we have an answer on where that might be going, but we know it's definitely on our list to consider because it's been mentioned to us by a few providers.
So another thing related to year prog, how would you know how to identify someone for inclusion in the NSS population?
So I think there are changes to the NSS, and I think potentially students on any year of the course might now be asked to fill it in. However, we have had discussions with Ella recently that actually we may still need to identify the final year. So I think until that's kind of decided and we've worked out which of the options we're going to go down with curriculum, I don't think we can answer at the moment how we would identify that.
Okay. More general question. Are you going to run a consultation on the course entity you are creating as the parent of these curriculum entities? Some elements are problematic, accreditation, for example, wrapped up as inherent on the course rather than as a separate entity given the way they change over the time students are on the course.
So we're not proposing a separate consultation, but within this consultation there's a list of data that's proposed to be held against the course, so please add any comments into the consultation about that. As I said, we have a specific question around accreditation and the way that that could work, so it's not a separate consultation, it's part of this consultation really, so do put your comments or thoughts within your response and we'll review those.
Okay, so Well, a question around the consultation text in question 15. If there are the phrases part-time and full-time, do these have specific meanings?
So I guess the first thing to say is that's a slight text error on the PDF copy. It should just say part-time or full-time basis. And we've kind of, up till now, just been assuming that similar definitions to kind of current student and current AP would apply. So they're not specific things, they're just generally what you'd kind of consider as a full-time and part-time students according to Funding Council definitions. Body definitions.
We have a question here about which scenario would DFE prefer for their ITT return data once it's amalgamated into data futures. Would both scenarios work for them?
So all statutory customers have been involved along the way with this, with these two options. They've all seen them. So far, all of them have been happy with either option, because either option will allow them to get the data they need. It will just depend on the way that you record it and which option is going to be easier for providers to return. So I think it would be fair to say, although obviously I will check this with them, either option is fine with them.
Would HESA prefer the 12-month period for a standard student to be the HESA academic year, 1st of August to the 31st of July, as per HESA a student return?
No, so I probably should have said this as we're going through the scenarios. And the idea with this is that whilst we need that year, either at the student course session or the session year level, that year can start whenever you like, wherever works best with whatever represents your provision. So a student that starts in a course or a student that starts in September or January or April or July, they should all, for these options, be returned in the same way, and it should be the same approach. So that idea of a reporting year will no longer exist, in that you can return that year-long chunk of time starting whenever matches your provision.
Do you have a diagram example for fast-track accelerated 2-year undergraduate provision?
We didn't do this as a specific example because it came out identical to the rest of the curriculum. So something like the, I guess the last one, the fully flexible one, you'd have to return a number of 12-month blocks that it was applicable, which is not necessarily matching up to the years that you would consider a year for an accelerated programme. So for that one, where there's 3 years doing it in the time of 2 years, you'd have 2 student course sessions or 2 session years returned for option A or B to do it. So no, we chose not to do one, but for that reason really, because it's the same.
If placement and non-placement students are linked to the same course, would we need to return an expected course length? If so, would it be the maximum, i.e. with placement?
So we don't have an expected end date on the curriculum. We do have an expected end date against the student, and please correct me if I'm wrong, I think where we're at with this one is that you would need to return it as the kind of what you're expecting that student to do. For example, if you expect them to do a placement, it might be 4 years in the future, but if that changed, we need to update that expected end date. Is that right?
I think that's what
yeah. So similar to now, you might change the expected length of study between 3 and 4 if the student changed their mind about a placement. It's similar with an expected end date that's now held against the student.
If we are late in finding out that a student intermitted or went dormant, can we make a historic amendment to their session data? And will there be a penalty for needing to do this and make historic amendments?
I think there will be certain items of data where we will allow you to add things on from the previous reference period. So like we kind of had updatability periods before, we'll probably allow you to do minor changes. So particularly things like that where you're not sure that they've gone dormant and you find out a bit later. And we will be quite explicit about which of those data items you can do that with and which of them you can't, and it will trigger off the historic amendments process. So right now I can't tell you exactly which ones they are because we haven't quite worked through the model to that extent, but we will tell you well before you have to return it which ones they will, so that you'll know when it's going to do that and when it won't.
If a student is a late starter but already had prior credits to cover the bit they missed, Should they be returned differently to someone who has just started late but catches up?
No, I don't think so. It's designed to represent that they're starting that course late, but still expected to sort of finish and study along with their fellow students. So whether that's because they started late and they're going to catch up, or whether they brought in previous credit, in terms of what you return the student course session, that would look the same.
So we are discussing with OFS at the moment for 2021 to bring in a new field where you can indicate that the student is bringing in previous credit. So for that example, that would probably be the difference between the students. Most of it would look the same, but you'd use this field to say, actually, this student is bringing in some previous credits, whereas the other student, you wouldn't have that.
Would PGC students who are just writing up in the final few months of their 14-month course still have 2 sessions since they are not technically active, i.e. the writing up isn't until after the first, starts before the first 12 months?
They would still need 2 student course sessions in that example, so we still need a student course session to be returned to represent the writing up period. You would have a session status indicating that they're writing up, but it does still need to be returned. So they'd have 1 year long student course session, then 1 short couple of months one, which was returned as being writing up.
For flexible provision, where students resit for modules, not for academic years or periods of an academic year, how would this be represented?
So in option A, for kind of flexible provision, you would just have year-long student course sessions starting whenever the student started and continuing until they finish. They would have modules associated with them, so we might see that they've done the same module twice, for example, but you would just return the modules against the student course session in which they studied them. For option B, as we said, we're not quite sure. The approach to session years might be for fully flexible, and as Rachel was saying, you've got the opportunity in the consultation to comment on that and whether it works. However, again, that would probably mainly be recorded at the module level, so we'd see the modules they were studying against the appropriate student course sessions, but the question is around whether you'd also have the session years kind of showing what they've done, but with fully flexible, it's different. If you're resitting modules as part of fully flexible, it's going to look different to if you're resitting as part of a more structured course for option B, because you don't have that session year showing the sort of the start date, because the start date maybe doesn't really exist as a curriculum concept. So it's going to look a bit different, and it wouldn't be the same approach for switching students between cohorts that might happen with more structured provision, because that concept doesn't really apply.
Okay. How would you expect a student that interrupts for 2 years but then turns into a withdrawal to be recorded?
So I think in this example, they'd be returned. You'd have to let us know that they'd gone dormant. That might work. Say that they'd interrupted, and then if you later find out that they are not going to be returning, we'd need you to return a leaver record with a backdated end date to the last time that they were active. So similar to how you would do that in our current collection, and we're still working through how validation would work, that will probably trigger some kind of continuity issue where we say, this student ended, you said this student ended 2 years ago, why did you not tell us at the time? But that's an example where that's sort of completely legitimate because you thought they were coming back and then they didn't. So we wouldn't expect that to have to be a kind of historical amendment. It might be something if there's high numbers or, again, as I said, we're working through the validation at the moment, that you might need to confirm within the system just to say, yeah, we thought the student was coming back and they're not, that's why their end date's in the past. But yeah, you would just need to return them with that backdated end date to show when they were last active.
Okay, so we've had a question about accreditation. Data Futures only covers pre-reg and courses like ITT, where the registration is fundamental to the course aim. Is the question more wide, like for courses with accreditation that we'd return in Unistats, but not currently in Data Futures coverage?
So the list of accreditations currently in Data Futures are for, as you said, those few specific use cases that we require within the student return. Unistats has a different purpose, so it's a much broader list of accreditations within that return. For the sort of short to medium term, I don't know, we're not currently expecting to expand that accreditation to the wider list. It may be at some point we have additional requirements in the student return and need to incorporate other accreditations, but at least for now, we're not expecting to have to add in all of that big list of accreditation within Unistat.
So for your response for this consultation, you can limit it to just the values we've got now, not all of the list that's in Unistat.
Okay. So we currently need a clear separate course indicator for the SLC to enable, for example, a foundation version of a course to attract loans for 4 years. Have the SLC commented on any of these proposals?
I think the short answer is no. No, they haven't. We have looked at some of the definitions to make sure that they align to definitions that the SLC use, and where they're slightly different, we know why they're different.
But I think that's where both options kind of have the benefit of that flexibility. So if you need to record a foundation course separately to the non-foundation version for SLC purposes, then you can record them separately in our data, or you can record them together if that makes more sense. So the benefit of these options is that flexibility. So hopefully that helps you to return it, not have to have it in different ways, one for the SLC, one for HESA. As much as we can, we try to be flexible. Inevitably, there's some cases where we can't, but that example, you can have it either way in terms of how you return it to HESA.
Okay, so another question about late starters. Am I right in assuming that the late starter flag is required under any transfer scenario? The concept seems to imply that the student is catching up, which looks as though it may have onward sector use in terms of monitoring these as a cohort. As an example, we currently have courses with many shared modules where a student transfers early in their studies and may not have very much or any catching up to do, but would potentially be flagged as such under these proposals.
I think in that example, it probably would be flagged as a late starter. In some cases, it indicates that the student's catching up. In others, as we said, it could be that they're bringing in credit from somewhere else, whether that's within your provider or from another provider. So there are a couple of different reasons why a student might have that flag. And I think anyone kind of looking at that information, analysing it, would need to be aware of that. So like you said, those kind of examples aren't necessarily that a student's kind of having to work at a higher intensity to catch up. It might be kind of a normal transfer where they've got shared modules. But that example, I think, would still be flagged as a late starter. It might be worth just saying within scenario 7 that we ran through for the transfer, the dates show that the student sort of started in September and then transferred in October, so it all happens within the first reference period. And if any of you've seen, we recently published our definition of discrete collections, and within that we clarified that if it all happens within one reference period, we would never see it. So the dates are slightly misleading in that scenario. So if the student started on a physics degree in September, moved to the maths degree in October, it's all within reference period 1, so we would only ever see the maths degree. If they transferred to the maths degree in December, you would have told us about the physics degree in reference period 1, and then we'd see the transfer in reference period 2. So that one's been slightly affected by our move from continuous to discrete collection. So for those very early transfers in your example about shared modules and moving between courses, they might not end up being reflected in the data if they happen within a couple of months. It just depends on when those dates fall.
Okay. For CPD students that only take one module in an academic year, would their COM date need to reflect the module start date or the 12-month session?
So the student start date should reflect their actual start date. Whether that matches with the planned curriculum start date or not, the student's date should always reflect their actual start date.
Okay, so with a year-long session, for example, if we have a 12-month PGT starting in late September, so the 25th of September, the following year, would the year start on the 25th or the 24th of September or the 26th of September?
Yeah, we've had this conversation around whether we need a little bit of a buffer in there, just because, you know, Monday falls on a different date every year. So there probably needs to be a little bit of flexibility. In our current collection, we have some of our validation looks at a kind of plus or minus 14 days to allow for term dates moving a little bit. We need to have a think about how you reflect that and make that clear in the guidance, just so it's more, where possible, it's kind of more realistic of your actual term dates rather than forcing it to be the 25th or whatever it was every year. So yeah, we need to figure that one out, I think.
We expect the same guidance will apply though.
Yeah.
So for fully flexible provision, can module study be returned against the course entity so it ties within our students, which is module focused?
I think, assuming that question has come from the OU, I think we will have to have a discussion with you about that. I think we've set it up in a way that you could do that, if that's what you kind of consider the student to do. But I think rather than trying to figure that out now, it's probably best if we take that away with you and discuss it later on, if that's all right.
Okay. So there's a question about question 10 in the consultation, and asking whether you could elaborate a little bit more on this.
So question 10 specifically, so that is the one around returning student course sessions, and for option B, whether or not you return them the same as the session year dates or whether you can have them a bit less. So I don't know if the slight confusion has come. It says as the second option, you can return them starting a month apart. That should say 12 months apart, not 1 month. So basically what we're trying to say is, do you want the session year to be 12 months long and the student course session to also be 12 months long? Or would it be better for providers, or would you prefer it if we have the session year has to be 12 months, but actually the student course session could be less? So if they're not studying for the whole year, say they've got holidays or whatever, however your curriculum is structured, do you want to kind of return them as less than 12 months to return their actual dates or not? So that's what that question is getting at. Which dates would you prefer to return on the student course session if the 12 months was enforced at session year level?
Okay. So someone has said that they are getting the impression that HESA prefer option B. Is this correct? And could you give us some details as to why?
So I think, yes. So we weren't going to indicate our preference in the consultation at all. But after talking to some providers, they indicated to us that actually it was more helpful to know what our preference was, so that you could not have to spend time looking at both options in lots and lots of detail, and actually if they didn't have enough time, they could just focus on the one that we preferred. As we started off this, we thought actually having less detail was better, but as we started going through a lot of the scenarios, we realised that, or we think that option B allows it to be a bit more flexible in terms of how you'd then return kind of dates on student course sessions. And some of the other bits, and it wouldn't mean that you'd need as many kind of flags, so like the late starter flag or any other flags. So we thought that option B kind of allows you to return closer to what potentially the reality is. So I think that's kind of what our preference is, and that's why we think that works better. But we don't know how you all record it in your system, so that might be an incorrect assumption, and so that's why we want you to tell us which of the two options is better for you and which you think will work. I think that's, yeah.
And the final question that we have is, do we know when the results of the consultation will be released to the sector?
That is a tricky question to answer. It's probably the most difficult one today. We want to make this decision as quickly as we can, because we know this will have quite a lot of ripple effects across the model. So it closes on the 11th of September. We need to sift through all of your responses, and hopefully a lot of providers will respond. We will then need to go through it with statutory customers, and we have a meeting, I think it's the week after it closes. So if we can get it all kind of sifted through and discuss it and agreed the week after, then hopefully we can announce it to you kind of in October-ish time. But I know you're all going to be in the throes of doing the current student and AP student collections, so you're going to be very busy during that time. So we would like to let you know as soon as possible. Exact dates, I'm afraid, will depend on how much we need to sift through and how much work we need to do around agreeing all the bits and pieces that you've suggested.
That's it. Okay, that's all the questions that we've had. As always, the liaison team are available at HESA to answer any and all questions that you might have. So please do get in touch with us with any questions that spring to mind. Otherwise, thank you very much for listening.